Okay, and then we have obviously introduction music.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh, stop.
Oh yeah. And this is fantastic.
Well, why don't we just jump into it? So I'm not going to butcher your own introduction because you have so much experience that I probably don't even know of, which is why you're sitting here. But Miss Ann Light, how are you?
Good. Okay,
Kicking
so
off.
I started at Bowling Green State University in a variety of other careers, but ended up in continuing education. And State Fire School was housed in continuing ed as one of a multitude of conferences that we ran. And it sort of grew over the years, and we took more and more ownership of it. It had sort of started out as a state-owned entity, and we took more and more ownership of it to the point where we were hiring the instructors, developing the curriculum, et cetera. And that became really one of the primary things that we did in continuing ed. Continuing ed dissolved at Bowling Green, as things do, and I picked that up and took it to political science and the Arts and Sciences College with me, because over the years we had many requests to develop a academic degree for firefighters or fire officers. We really weren't sure. So we put together a focus group and started asking people, which direction should we go? And it became apparent fairly early on that the market was fairly saturated with fire engineering degrees, fire science degrees. And so we really started, and being affiliated with the university, we really started to look towards more leadership and officer development. And so pulled together a group of individuals, fire chiefs, fire officers, and basically the initial question was, what do you wish you'd known when you stepped into the job? And so in about 2000 and early 2000s, I can't remember the exact year, it took a long time, we started to develop this degree and take it through the Board of Regents and all the approval processes at Bowling Green, and launched our first cohort in 2011. I started my doctorate in 2011 because I'd sort of developed an interest in learning more about this as well. And my dissertation research was based along those same lines of what did you wish that you had known or been better prepared for, or what were you prepared for and what prepared you for it to take on the chief leadership position in a fire department. And I focused my research on metropolitan fire chiefs and the definition of that is a size between 400 and 2,000 members.
Oh, okay.
So over the course of about a year, I interviewed 9 metropolitan fire chiefs two times. And the third time was a wrap-up where we reviewed the results and made sure that I was accurate and did they have any follow-up kind of thoughts on that, and then distilled that down, which makes it sound very simple. But then the hard part came where we literally analyzed the transcripts of all of those interviews and started to pick up emergent themes of what they had said. Where did we start to see themes of they all kind of said things along this line, even though their experiences were vastly different, and come up with some sort of pillars of what we looked at to further develop the degree, because we wanted to make sure the fire administration degree that we developed was applicable and valuable, but also in hopes that we would help other people to understand kind of what they're getting into and how to prepare themselves for promotion or even going into the fire service and looking at that as the ultimate goal.
That's awesome.
You interviewed them twice. How long were each of those interviews?
An hour each.
Okay.
Yeah.
In their office or just?
The first one was, I think there was only one that I had to do by phone. Every other one the first one was in their office. I would fly or drive to wherever they were. The second one, if they were local enough to me where I could drive to them, the second one was also in person. Okay. And then the wrap-up one was phone.
How receptive were they to those interviews? Or was it like,
question.
oh, yeah, let's jump into this? Or, no, we're not talking.
Yeah.
No, well, I was in a really fortunate and unique position of having developed a lot of relationships over the years through State Fire School. We'd had an advisory board for years, so I knew people through that, and also some of the instructors that came to State Fire School. One in particular was Dr. Graylin Stargill, who earned his doctorate several years before and worked a lot with coaching, executive coaching with a lot of chiefs. So he kind of endorsed me and recommended me to some people. You don't just go knock on,
You don't.
XYZ big city department and go, hey, I'm trying to get my degree. Will you talk to me? And so I knew a couple of chiefs that I worked with, and then he recommended me to some others, and then they would sort of endorse me to the next ones and say, okay, she's okay to talk to.
Yep.
She's serious about this, and so once I got in to talk to them, incredibly receptive. I mean, oh my goodness, so many of them said, no one ever comes in my office and asks me how I am. Nobody ever comes in here and asks me what my job is like. And so, we just had different amazing conversations because, it's an hour or 2 hours, initially the hour, and sometimes they went over. I mean, I certainly wasn't going to cut them off. I enjoyed talking.
Okay,
I enjoyed talking to them immensely. And, a lot of times I traveled a long time to get there.
Yeah.
So we just kind of rolled and had these conversations, and I never got the impression that any of them were holding back or uncomfortable, or they probably wouldn't have said yes in the first place. But
so you had pillar themes throughout the research and throughout the interviews. Besides those themes, what were they wanting to talk about?
It's a good question.
I mean, that might be a harder question.
No, it's not. It's initially, the questions are very open-ended. This is what's called qualitative research. So I wasn't going in there with a survey. I was going in with some guide questions, and they knew what they were ahead of time.
Okay.
So there was no amount of me ever trying to paint somebody into a corner or anything. This was all, and the interviews would go in different directions depending on their experience. But initially, what they really wanted to talk about was their experience coming up, how they got started, their different kinds of experience, positions they held, whether they worked in 40 hours when they went into EMS, the first time they hit a bureau or administrative position, working in what's called internal affairs or training, and the pivotal points in their career when the transition was big. So I would say the first one is going from firefighter to officer, lieutenant, where they call it going from buddy to boss, where, 1 minute you're with your buds and the next minute you got to keep your buds alive and turn into a different role. And we talked a lot about, in some departments, that position is taken seriously enough that there's officer development that goes into that before you take over that position. And in some departments, you're a firefighter one day, a lieutenant the next day, go for it.
How about it? Yeah.
And some of them experience that either way.
Sure.
And then the next really pivotal point that they all talked about was when you go from captain to battalion chief. Because at that point, you're not just worrying about your unit or your house. It becomes more of a global perspective on the fire department. And they all talked about that. And going into administrative positions to start to look at the department from a bigger perspective in terms of the department and then how it fits into the larger community. But I mean, they all loved their operational experience, and they all, most of them talked about how they left it kicking and screaming because they loved it. That's what they wanted to do. Yeah. But they knew if they wanted to promote, they had to take on an administrative position. And every single one of them said absolutely critical to do that.
Did they all want to be fire chiefs originally?
Not necessarily. Some of them, no. I think a lot of them wanted to be firefighters and EMTs. And but you start to get a little older, and honestly, sometimes, and I'm not speaking for all of the chiefs necessarily, but I mean, I certainly think people can relate to the fact that too, you go for a promotion sometimes because you figure, if I don't do it, who am I going to be working for?
Oh, that's an interesting perspective.
So, But no, I don't think I can't think to a person where they stepped on to the fire ground, for their recruit class and thought I'll be chief someday. That goal was just too far off for them. I think some of them were a little bit surprised that they were where they were because life circumstances happen.
Yeah.
You get lucky, you get mentored really well, your perspective changes, and then you're the chief of a metropolitan fire department. Sounds easy, but it's a winding path for some of them.
That's super interesting. So I'm going to circle back a little bit because you mentioned like common threads. Everybody kind of had some stuff. So were there any that still stick out to you? Like some of the stuff that people said, that was like I wish I would have known this kind of coming up through the service?
I think the thing that came out over and over and over again that probably, I don't know that it surprised me, but it was just so apparent once I realized it and we started talking about it, is the utter institutional complexity of a large fire department. And I'm not to diminish smaller fire departments.
Sure.
They are very complex as well. And I remember people at the university asking me, why would a fire chief need a degree, or why would a fire chief need education? And certainly there's other paths. We had chiefs who were military. We had there's a lot of ways to get there. But just in the context of this conversation, why would they even need that? Why couldn't they just come up through the ranks? And I think there's a perception even sometimes within the fire service that the chief is, the head guy that's in charge of who squirts water where, when some of these guys are in charge of a $500 million budget or more. They're basically CEOs of a massive company, but have the challenge that it's not a profit center and it's never closed. You can't roll back production because things are not working.
Sure.
You're going, 24 hours a day with your employees who live together. And there's a high potential that you have shareholders externally, shareholders internally, and you have to worry about mass emergencies and literally keeping your employees alive. And most bosses don't walk into work every day with all of those things going on. So you're budgeting, finance, public relations, all of those things. That was the thing that I think surprised them as they were coming up through the ranks, and to an extent, I won't say impressed me that how incredibly complex that position is.
That's interesting. Relating it to a business makes a lot of sense because a lot of is that just something that people, you don't know what you don't know type situation, like until you're in the role?
I think the fire service is so romanticized too.
Sure.
Sometimes that you think that it's all life and death running into buildings, but when you get to that level, it's negotiation. It's you're a public figure, and they did talk about the impact it had on the families, the amount, extreme satisfaction with their jobs to a person, about how much they loved and were kind of honored to serve their community that way. But the toll it takes on your family time and trying to manage your stress, and the fact that your family's in it with you, and everybody kind of has to be on board with that. The intricacies of the relationship between a fire chief and a union president. And when I saw those relationships being positive and successful, just amazing what work they can do. When they're adversarial, it can take up so much time and energy that it's just really tough. So I saw a couple of chiefs who did struggle with that because sometimes it was not even the two personalities of those people. It was a generational. Sure. It was almost like the Hatfields and McCoys. McCoys, feuding in that culture of that particular city. That it was just kind of like, well, we just hate each other, and that's the way it is.
It's interesting.
But if it works well, it's amazing.
You've seen stuff like that happen too, whether it's that relationship or lack of. But that's that relationship probably can be huge. But same as, chief to assistant chief, or really any of those relationships can make or break a successful department. Well,
and that was another thing that I had never realized and which I think is another thing that sets this position apart from, if you hire a CEO, they'll generally make a sweep and bring in the people that they want, or a university president, or whoever.
Yeah.
A lot of times, because of contractual obligations, when the fire chief gets hired, particularly externally, but not always if they get hired internally, several of your then assistant chiefs or deputy chiefs probably applied for the job too.
Sure.
And want it. And
Right.
there is no clean sweep because those positions are all protected. So now your closest colleagues in the fire department may be people who wanted the job. And so you have to adapt and deal with that, because you can't just sweep them out and say, I'm bringing in my own people in a lot of cases.
So that almost can foster a little bit of resentment or something like that.
Little, yeah.
It's interesting.
But I talked to chiefs who were able to turn it around with people,
Sure.
and then a couple that was really cutthroat where people were gunning for them.
Well, and I'm curious if you experienced this, where maybe one of the fire chiefs was hired for a specific reason, like the commissioners or whoever comes in, hires them with a purpose. Like, we have a project for you to do. Like, get rid of all the assistant chiefs. Get rid of. Did you see anything like that where they were hired with some type of objective? Or
I didn't in mind. I'm sure it happens, but it wasn't. I don't think it was something that happened.
The complexity, I'm fascinated. You mentioned that as well. The complexity. What do you see in the larger departments versus the smaller departments, or vice versa, as far as complexity goes? Like, we talk about union, we talk about government, we're talking about members, we're talking about community. There's a lot of complexities, politicians, everything, right?
Politics is a big one too. People love to say in the fire service, I've heard them say it, that I don't like politics, I don't do politics. And the chief said that that's not an option. Everything is political.
Yeah.
So you have to be able to play in that arena because you're at a director level with everybody in your city. I mean, back to your question, obviously I didn't research those sizes, but over the 20, 30 years, I've met some people. I think it's probably very similar.
Okay.
And you can say on a smaller scale, but that doesn't lessen the intensity for the person who's in that position. So you still have a city manager, you still have a city council, you still have and even maybe more so your constituents, your citizens, if you're relying on them for levies or any other kind of political or financial support. They're your shareholders, and you're also going out and asking them to support you. So that's a whole nother level of responsibility that those mid-size and smaller chiefs have, because they essentially have to be fundraisers for their department as well. And then they're working with volunteers and combo departments and trying to really get employees to come in and essentially work for free. I mean, sometimes they get paid per call, et cetera, but that's been a big challenge over the last many years. So I think my answer is they have their own challenges, and I certainly even think volunteers of chiefs of volunteer departments have certainly a whole nother set of challenges, and I would never diminish the work that they do, because you're essentially running a mini business with volunteers. And if you've ever worked with having to keep volunteers, engaged and motivated, like, you better be on your game, because they really have to believe that they belong to something that's important. I think one of the final pillar of the theme that they talked about, there were kind of four that popped out, but the one was answering the call. And they all talked about how this is truly a calling, and that you need to know yourself. And I love talking to them about that, because they had this sense of humility about that you need to know your ego. You need to know where your motivation comes from. You need to know. One guy talked about, which I just thought was fascinating, is that he said he realized the day he became chief that he had the power in that department to retaliate against any person in that department who had ever done him wrong. And he said, I made sure that I had my ego in check, and I never did that, and I never did anything that would even hint of it. But it's true, though.
Wow.
And so collectively, they all talked about this kind of inner strength, knowing yourself, knowing whether or not you're going to be able to handle being a public figure, whether you're going to be able to give up that level of privacy. Do you have the energy to bring to the position? because you're kind of on when you're there. So if you, to your department members, to the public, to city council, do you have the energy to bring that it needs, that you need to dedicate to this? But the things they talked about, kind of humility and ego and keeping yourself in check and not getting full of yourself and focusing on the service side of the position was really kind of inspirational to me. And I think it can be applied to a lot of things in life,
Absolutely.
beyond the fire service. I think we can all get a little full of ourselves sometimes.
It's interesting because you said, I made a note, you said early, nobody asked me how I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? So,
yeah, when you're the boss,
Yeah.
everybody comes in your office probably wanting something.
So that's interesting. I'm curious as to how did you talk to them about how they, kind of dealt with that on a daily basis? Obviously, you mentioned having that inner strength, and that's probably part of it.
100% peer group. They all talked about how you have to have a professional network of people within the fire service and outside the fire service. I mean, just like in business, where
Sure.
you have a peer group where you can bounce things off of people and talk to other people.
Did they have them?
The successful ones did. I had, I think,
That's an interesting point right there.
They did. A lot of them, 5 out of the 9 that I interviewed had all been through the JFK, John F. Kennedy Leadership School at Harvard.
Okay.
Absolutely pivotal experience in their lives. Not only because of the curriculum, which is impressive, and I'm not sure if they're still doing it. I meant to look that up because I know it stopped for a while, but they may have restarted it. But they built in that a network of peers across public health, law. I mean, everybody from all walks of life in leadership go to that. So it's not just the fire service. That was really important.
What's it called?
It's the John F. Kennedy Leadership through Harvard.
Kyle, will you look that up? Thanks.
He's on it.
I'm curious now to see if it's still going.
Yeah, the way they talked about
you
that
go.
was life-changing.
Kyle's got to change out his squeaky chair.
He found it.
Kyle.
Yeah.
All right, Kyle.
Dang it, Kyle.
Damn it, Kyle.
Sorry, I had to put him on the spot. Now I look at it. Now he's got to work for it.
I sort of looked it up last night.
Yeah, I honestly can't even imagine that.
No.
So was there anything that you learned for somebody else who might find themselves in a position like that? Because obviously, based on what we've talked about already, you don't know what you don't know until you're in it, right? So because that's tough. Because you wanna do right by the department and by your team, but if you find yourself in over your head, what do you do?
Well, one of the things they talked about in the whole category of humility is being willing to reach out to other people in the similar positions and saying, I don't know, I need help.
Yeah.
And having a mentor that you can talk to, which is easier said than done, depending on the size of the organization that you're in.
No kidding.
You may be the mentor,
Yeah.
So, gosh, it's a great question. I'm not sure I have the answer to it. I mean, they were kind of more talking retrospectively in terms of what they felt like had prepared them or what they weren't prepared for. I mean, a couple of them that, maybe hadn't had the formal education or military experience or other things that prepared people just said self-taught. And I mean, that's, so for budgeting and accounting and those sorts of things, literally they were sitting down reading textbooks to learn how to walk into a budget meeting and talk. Because they said every time you go into a meeting or a situation and you don't
That's
know,
crazy.
you're at the mercy of somebody else.
Yeah.
And one of the chiefs said, I knew I could do it and I knew I could figure it out. But he said, I also knew, had I been educated about this going into it, what took me 10 hours would have taken me 10 minutes. So it was just this enormous amount of catch-up work to not look vulnerable in situations. So I don't know if that's a really good. I don't know that that's a good answer. It's
is.
complicated.
Yeah. Well, and I think the undercurrent here is the peer network, right?
Very important.
Have somebody or a group of people that you can lean on.
Right.
Because
because your ego is going to get bruised, and it's going to, and you're going to get pummeled publicly.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things they talked about
Yeah.
too, is that not everybody in the public's going to love you either. And actually, one of my chiefs had a line of duty death in between, well, 2 line of duty deaths together, in between our 2 interviews. So that just took
Oh,
an enormous turn because,
Wow.
I mean, for obvious reasons of how tragic it was, but now you're leading a department that's in trauma, absolute
Yes.
trauma, people who are in trauma. The city's looking to you to see, what happened and how you're going to handle it and what you're going to do with it. And there's a certain fraction of people who are going to blame you
Yeah.
and pick apart everything that you've ever done in your life or department. And so it starts to fracture your department as well. So, that was just a whole nother. You better have a peer group at that point.
Yeah, no kidding.
Can they win? Is there like any?
Oh my God!
job.
In
a
spite of
loaded
everything
question.
I'm telling you, they love their jobs and
That's so
they absolutely
weird.
love.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, because we're talking about the things that make it difficult. But
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
many of them talked about, they love being out in the community. They loved, being part of even charity events and going
Yeah.
out and talking to kids and interacting with, director level people across
Yeah.
the city, the head of public health or hospitals or whatever. Absolutely loved mentoring young firefighters, going to recruit schools, helping with training. One of them talked about how it was really an important part of what he felt like was his job is to manage the expectations of recruits, so that, because he said sometimes the dissatisfaction in the fire service comes when people come into it thinking that every day is going to be, busting in doors and
Yep.
putting out fires and being the hero. And he said, we're a service industry.
Yep.
And so you have to know going into this that we are service. And people are going to call you for every little thing. And sometimes it's an emergency and sometimes it's not. And you don't get to say, you have to be nice. And he said, at least in my department, you have to be nice.
Yeah.
Because I won't tolerate anything else. So, but when you're running a great big fire department is got to be a lot of fun too.
Sure.
It's not all, this
Yeah, and
challenges and terrible things. You get a really cool hat.
cool hat. You get a cool shirt.
You're at the head
Yeah.
of the table. And,
Yeah.
and who doesn't love a fire chief? I mean,
Sure.
Well, there are some.
there are
Some
some
people
people,
might not,
but
yeah.
they're generally very well loved in the community and well respected. Although I think the position deserves more respect
Sure.
for the complexity of it, and that was part of why I wanted to kind of tell their story, because
Yeah.
when what they do is pretty incredible.
You talk about the humility part, and there was a captain I was talking to recently, and I asked him the question, hey, where do you get feedback from running a call or having a difficult situation? And he paused and thought about it. And, I don't talk to anybody. And I said, okay, what do you mean? He goes, no, I actually never thought about it. Like, I don't. I said, why not? And I let it pause, and I knew what his answer was going to be. Finally, I just said, because you're the best. He goes, yeah, who else am I looking up to?
Oh, wow. Well, I will
Interesting.
tell you, too, that they also said you better have a healthy ego. So,
Sure.
I mean, it's really a balancing act between you
Yeah.
have to have humility in some parts of the job, but you better have a strong ego if you're going to run a fire department.
And that was the whole thought, was like, okay, all these guys are getting to the top of their performance, and they keep on rising up. They're getting promoted and put in positions because they do their job well. The higher you get, the lower you get. And you have to find different ways to get mentors or feedback and finding different avenues. Because when you start in the fire industry or as a firefighter, well, yeah, you have an engineer, you have a lieutenant, you have a captain right there. Mm-hmm. But then you rise up higher and higher. Well, then you're a captain at your station. Nobody directly to talk to right after a call. And so you have to find new ways of doing it. And so as you're talking, I'm thinking about, from a fire chief standpoint, they have to walk into this from the get-go in complete humility.
But also with some chutzpah.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And back to the complexity, right?
Right, 100%.
Like,
Yeah.
hey, be the dude, but also
Right. Yeah.
Right.
eat some.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
be the humble.
Yeah, I mean, and that has to be tough. I mean, it obviously takes, training's probably the wrong word, but it takes some time in the position,
Yeah.
I would assume, to figure out that balance, right?
Well, they really talked in one of the final themes of my thing was competency and context. So they really talked about building competency, operational competency, through the operational ranks. That obviously that builds your confidence if you're the best, on the technical rescue team, or you're the best driver, or you're whatever, and you have all this expertise. You start to build some sort of gravitas among your peers, and also confidence within yourself. But you have to continue that as you're going up through the administrative ranks,
Yep.
because what prepares you to be the best operationally does not prepare you to be the best fire chief.
Yep.
Also, because you have to be fairly autocratic as a lieutenant or captain on a fire scene, because we're not here to debate what I tell you. You're going in, coming out, you're doing this, you're not doing that. It's not time to sit around and talk about that. I'm in charge.
Sure.
When you get into the higher administrative roles, that leadership style doesn't typically work really well with your peers. So you have to be able to make that shift as well.
Yeah.
So.
Wow.
All right, I got one more.
Okay.
That I'm gonna circle back to, because it's something we've been trying to kind of cover and touch on. Is the you got notes? You want to go through them?
Do you have no?
No, I
You
want
got
to make sure I didn't
circles
forget
and
Notes
anything.
for me?
Well, here, you can have this.
No, so it's, and you kind of touched on it, right? Like they love being out in the community and doing those events and working with their communities, and so it's super easy for a firefighter or a fire chief to get put on a pedestal by their community, or by the everyday person, we'll call it, right? Because
Everybody loves a firefighter,
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So one of the things that we're trying to do throughout this podcast is sort of bring that back down and give that a little bit of relatability. So during your interviews and stuff like that, did anybody talk about, and it probably goes back to that peer network again, but did anybody talk about, being at the top and, kind of being put on this pedestal without wanting to be on a pedestal? Because it's so easy to, especially for fire chiefs, to kind of put them up there and they're the guy that everybody looks up to, but who are they looking up to?
I'm not sure.
So I just didn't know, because and Jared, you said it too, the higher you get, the lonelier it gets, right? And then, so maybe it is just getting out in the community more, or, did anybody touch on how they were relating with their communities a little bit more, and sort of eliminating that barrier, or, making sure they're approachable, that kind of stuff?
A lot of them were very involved in certain aspects of the community. So EMS, if that was a particular passion of them coming up, then they were probably more involved in emergency management and affiliating with hospitals and things like that. Trying to think. I mean, they weren't. A lot of them had great. We touched on how those relationships between assistant director, deputy chiefs can be difficult if the person was applying for the job. But a lot of those relationships are fantastic too. So they have those people around them who they're deputy chiefs and assistant chiefs, who are essentially their inner circle, vice presidents, as if you want to compare it to the business scene. So they have those people that some of them talked about how much they depended on them and how incredibly talented and competent they were, to the point where, the chief could actually go on vacation, which some of them did not feel that way, but others, said I can actually go away with my family once in a while. But they were on a lot of boards, boards of directors, different kinds of advisory boards, and a lot of professional conferences, networking that way. So I think, but as far as being put on a pedestal by the community, I think it just comes with the territory, until it doesn't. And I think probably that's probably I I don't think they worry about something terrible happening and how it's going to affect their image. They worry about something terrible happening because the terrible things that happen
Right.
are dire.
Yeah.
Worst case scenario, they lose one of their firefighters.
Yeah, it's it's another one of those balance things, right? They get put on a pedestal by the community, but then you also mentioned that as soon as if there's a line of duty death or something, now they're playing PR director and having to manage
Grief
that image,
counselor
grief
and-
counselor.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's I can only imagine honestly how tough it would be to manage something like that, because it almost can happen at the flip of a switch where everything's fine and then the next day it's not, and you have to almost play a totally different role.
And then you have just all the regular things that happen in any big organization, discipline and rewards and, human
Yeah.
resources and scheduling and budgeting and, all of the things to keep the wheels running.
Yeah. It's funny you wrote there, and I didn't think about it, talking about the complexity of the fire industry and fire departments. What other industry has employees that live together?
Military, really. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
And
and
you-
you've got employees. If you're starting to argue with the fellow down the hall,
Sure.
you go home tonight.
Yeah, for sure.
You start arguing with the fellow down the hall, and you sleep in the bed next to you.
Yeah.
But that's more on the lieutenant and the captain, unless it gets out of line.
and we talked about this, the idea that the fire service is, typically thought as a paramilitary. However, military doesn't have a union, right? It doesn't have a lot of things the fire service has, which makes this so complex.
Right.
So different.
Yeah. And leading an organization like that, knowing your timeline is what 3 to 7 years, like
Yeah.
sometimes if you're lucky, it makes it a challenge. But for those that succeed, however they define what success is, they almost just don't care. Like I've gotten that before. Like, hey, if I lose this job, I lose this job, or whatever. And I think that was part of the humility that I've experienced, and the complexity thing is something special.
It really is.
And one more question for a wrap up. You
Okay.
ready?
Yeah.
Of all of your interviews, is there anything that you would put out there into the world for anybody who's, in the fire service, maybe looking at fire chief, maybe they don't even know they want to be fire chief, that they should pay more attention to?
Good question.
It is a good question. I need a minute to think about that. Well, I mean, I'm probably slightly biased because I come from a higher ed background, so I would say education is never going to do you wrong. Even and a lot of there were some of the chiefs that are here who had degrees in biology.
Oh, that's interesting.
But they talked about how that enhanced their critical thinking skills, and it enhances the critical thinking skills of their employees. But I would really encourage people to really look at the fire service with eyes wide open and talk to people who are in these higher positions to really get a true idea of what's involved and the complexity that's involved. It doesn't have to be daunting, but I think preparing for it and understanding that you're going to have a broader perspective, and if you are preparing, at some point you're going to have to take that leap out of operations, which is what every fire chief loves to do. I was sitting in offices where we could hear the sirens going out, and they're like, I still wish I was on that truck. But at some point you have to let go of being on that truck if you want to have a broader impact on the department.
Do you mind if I ask one more?
Yeah, no, shoot.
Being that you're still connected to the fire industry and the fire service in your own way, after doing this paper, after getting your degree, after all the work you did anything change you in how you interact with the fire service, whether it be from a chief standpoint, firefighter standpoint, industry, department, whatever?
I think absolute respect for the fire service, but the understanding that we do it a disservice when we romanticize it. I think of course that happens in TV shows and things like that.
Always.
But I think it almost diminishes it in a way.
Yeah.
Because it's so complicated, and we romanticize firefighters as if they're always perfect heroes,
Yep.
surging in, and they're fallible human beings. There's 2 million firefighters in the United States who are dealing with a myriad of different things. I think the fire service has come a long way in looking at how to help people deal with the things that they see and deal with on a daily basis, and also when appropriate, just leaving them alone as a group to deal with it on their own. But yeah, I think it kind of probably peeled back some of the kind of glory of it. Although I'm still, I'm married to a firefighter. I've been working in this for
You're not special.
30 years.
Yeah.
No, they're absolutely special and wonderful people. But I think, absolute respect.
Yeah.
For all levels of the fire service, but probably just a more realistic view of what's involved. But at the same time, I also realize I haven't done it. I'm not a firefighter. I've never been a firefighter, and I'm very conscious of the fact that I don't want to make grand proclamations about the fire service when I have no business doing to. I've never been on one run in my, in my life. I'm still on the outside looking in. But honestly, just incredibly humbled and grateful that these people gave me their time and were so open with me about their experiences.
That's good.
That was good.
It was fun to go back and read it because
Yeah.
you're so tired.
How long was it since you read it?
Oh, since 2016 when I was finished.
Just a minute.
When you finished with that doctorate, you're like,
Yep.
I don't want to
I
see
don't
this
even want to
again
think
for a
about
while.
it anymore. Yep.
But the interviews are my favorite part to read. They're just really interesting.
I'd be remiss. What are you doing now?
What am I doing now?
You come on. I'm leading you. I already know what you're doing now.
You mean what am I doing now? Like not
Nothing.
driving home to
Nothing.
Cincinnati, working at Howell Rescue,
Yeah.
Crash Course Village.
Yeah.
My retirement gig. Yeah, I really thought I was kind of done working and was sort of just hanging out, but I was bored.
No, we got
And
you.
COVID really did me in because I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to be out traveling and doing all these things, and then COVID hit, and then I found out how terrible I am at doing nothing.
Yeah.
And
I can relate.
I really did miss it because I mean, there's so many connections, and that's what I love about the fire service. I mean, I can be sitting in the airport in LA and run into somebody, and within 5 minutes, we know 6 of the same people.
That's awesome.
And I loved my last 10 years at BG. I was an advisor and director for fire administration, so I loved all those connections across the country. So then when Todd asked me to come in and help out here, I was like, I think I do still have something to give back, or something to contribute. So, yeah, working at Crash Course Village, helping do more training for the fire service, and loving it.
Love it.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Cool. That's all I got. Thank you for your time, obviously.
And thank
Thank
you.
you. It's fun.
We had a good time. There's some good stuff in there, so I appreciate you sharing.
Yeah,
thing.
absolutely. Thank you.
Yep.
Till next time.
Till next time.
Thanks, guys.